Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. This week we focus on the arts. Coming up, we'll profile two artists and an author. But we begin with a local legend who's an artist, musician, cartoonist, and as you can imagine, a fascinating person. Christian Valle spent some time with Bob Diven for our series, Living Here.
North Valley Highway, round about dusk. No one else on the road tonight but you and an old blue pickup truck. Rows and rows of pecan trees, as far as the eye can see. Just about time for harvest after a late fall.
People who know me or know my work have often said, "Oh yeah, I could tell that was a Diven. You know, I could tell that was yours." And I think, how can you? You know, it's in a different medium, but there, you know, something about us comes through as individuals. Well, I was born in a small town in Illinois. My father was a school teacher, but he brought the family out in 1964 when I was 5 years old. So I grew up here, basically. And I had 4 older brothers who were all interesting, creative people. So through my older brothers, I was exposed to photography, guitar, drawing, and they all were in band. They all learned to play an instrument, so I learned to play an instrument. Having that kind of family, I think, is what introduced me to the possibilities, that these sorts of things were possible. Over the years, I've had opportunity to then explore the other talents. So sequentially, I was able to go from drawing into painting, and from painting to writing and photography, and then music and songwriting, and then sculpture, and then think mostly in terms of the variety of things I do at a professional level. And that's just been the byproduct of trying to accept the responsibility for my gifts, you know. I did my first show on the Las Cruces Community Theater stage when I was in 7th grade, I think. So I think it was in their 10th season, which means I've been doing shows there for 45 years, something like that. Played leads and I played little parts and all that stuff. Most notable past projects, I think Magellan the Dragon at the Renaissance Fair. You know, Celebrate, the bus stop down in front of City Hall. Wall Street, this show I did in Pennsylvania at a gallery, the Laurie Dagenstein Gallery, where they'd seen my street art and had me come in and do this temporary art installation where I just used pastels and chalks and created all these temporary paintings over about 240 feet of linear space on this gallery wall. I just took over the gallery, spent about 2 weeks doing it. And then it was up for a month and then they washed it all off. It was really cool. People know me for the rat catcher. God, you know, I've been involved with that Renaissance Fair for probably 25, 28 years, I don't know. And one year I was the king. They made me the king, you know, and Sherry White was the queen. She's still the queen. And so I made an outfit and I was the king, and just being the king just didn't suit me. It wasn't very satisfying. It was kind of stuffy and, you know, it wasn't much fun. And I sort of went the opposite direction. The next year I just got this inspiration of, what about a rat catcher? And so I made this ragged peasant costume and I sewed a bunch of dead rats on a stick and went around as this character. And it was like my world had turned around. Something about that character made people feel, they made people laugh, made people feel open to come up and approach me. And then the next year, I think I did that 2 years, and then I got the idea for the Ratapult. And that evolved over a couple of years until eventually this whole Rat Catcher Robert show evolved. And now I've been doing that for, I don't know, 15 years, been doing that show. I've been doing the Sunday editorial cartoon for the Sun News, Las Cruces Sun News, for 11 years now, 11 and a half years. And people tend to call them political cartoons. I insist on calling them editorial cartoons because they're not always political. You know, it took me a month or 2 or 3 or 6 to kind of figure out what my style was going to be, because I had to develop a style that was appropriate to the thing, because you don't want to be spending 6 hours drawing an editorial cartoon. Early on I realized, okay, my job is not to wield a hatchet. My job is more to shine a flashlight. Just say, oh, look, this subject, this issue deserves your attention. And I can't answer all the questions about it, and my perspective may not be the correct one, but, you know, I have to have a point of view, and I have to communicate it. The rabbit is my spokesmodel, is what the rabbit is. And so it always makes my heart go, ugh, when somebody say, you know, I like your cartoons, but I just didn't get last week's. Like, oh. But I have to be philosophical about it. And my idea is that over the years, this is what I say, I said, not everybody gets every cartoon, but eventually everybody gets their cartoon. The cartoon about the thing they care about, right? The best place is either my website, bobdiven.com, or I have a Facebook page, Bob Diven Artist, and there's samples of my work there, and I tend to sort of, you know, mention whatever the latest project was. Find a good school, and don't be afraid that they're going to turn you into something you don't want to be. You know, when you're starting out, don't be afraid to try to imitate somebody else. You are not going to turn into Norman Rockwell if you try to paint a Norman Rockwell. It's impossible. So give yourself the benefit of some good training. And don't worry, you know, you will find your voice. It's a wonderful thing to be able to create things that didn't exist before. It's not bad.
The Native Americans say that blindness is a blessing in disguise. And I think that's true. It can crush you and defeat you, but you kind of have to meet it, greet it, and defeat it. I've lived a tragic, magnificent life altogether. You know, going blind at 15, my mom raised me, I didn't have a father. Went through college when nobody went to school, being handicapped. I was one of the first blind people ever to come to New Mexico State before there was, you know, talking computers and speech systems for the blind. Actually, I've been painting all my life, but went full-time about 25 years ago. So the art is a therapy for me. Without my books that I write and my art, I just don't know what I would do. Sit home, watch TV, I guess, you know. It's definitely abstract. I see things in dreams in color, and I sketch it like the next day or 2 days later. And I use a lot of finger painting, very little brush strokes. So my paintings are very large and full of bright colors. And I like circles, and I like mountains, so I make, you know, like a sun, a circle from a coffee can. It's pretty cool. And I use mountains for my kids, Maria and Michael. I use the letters M and M for the mountains. I got a phone call from New Mexico State, and they said, are you going to be around for homecoming? You won the 2014 Distinguished Alumni Award. So Danny invited me to his press box. You know, on the phone, people Google my art. And he was talking about how he loved art. He wanted to get together with me and buy some art and put it up on all the blank walls in New Mexico State. So I've donated 5 paintings so far to New Mexico State, but these 2 that we're gonna show today are in memory of Danny. And, you know, I don't know him well, but that conversation I had with him and a couple afterwards, he was a very nice man. He was a patron of the arts, and he was just very interested in my life story and my struggle. You know, here we are 3 years later, but that's okay. Very abstract. You're not going to see Native American dancers. You're not going to see Danny, kicking the football, but they are bright colors, and that's how my mind's eye sees it. I cannot realistically paint Danny or a place kicker or a Native American dancing. So I'd pick out the colors and the motions, and both paintings have a lot of motion in it. If you want to learn more about my life story, you can go to georgemendoza.com. There's 3 words to any dream that you have, whether it's a writer or artist, and it's persistence, persistence, and persistence. An artist's life is sometimes isolated and it's full of rejections. I've done like 1,200 paintings, but only 75 are in my traveling art show. But that's good, that's okay. If you're going to be a writer, you have to write. If you're going to be a painter, you have to paint. And definitely when I was a runner, I had to run. You can't just talk about it. You actually, it's action. You have to do it.
Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno. Today we talk about a new book called The Final Mission, Preserving NASA's Apollo Sites, which highlights space archaeology and heritage. The book is authored by Lisa Westwood, Wayne Donaldson, and Dr. Beth O'Leary, Professor Emerita from the Department of Anthropology here at New Mexico State University. Thank you so much for joining us, Beth O'Leary.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I'd like to talk about the book. Could you give us a brief description of the book and why it really came about?
Well, the book is about space archaeology and heritage, and it looks at sites, mostly within the United States, that were connected with a very extraordinary event. And that event, of course, is to put 2 guys on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And there are a myriad of facilities. We talk about space heritage as a cultural landscape. So there are rocket test stands, there are launch complexes, there's manufacturing facilities, and all of these contributed to getting those people up there on the moon and into outer space. So the book is a look at the historic context of the space era and what's happened to these properties now.
Now, I mean, you could probably give us a description of what has really happened to those properties. I mean, this is really something that hasn't been upkept.
Well, some of them are reused. I worked out at White Sands Missile Range on Launch Complex 36, and that vehicle assembly building was created in 1960 for the Little Joe rocket. It's now been repurposed, and NASA starts and builds their sounding rockets there. So that is still in place, and that is still being used, albeit a little bit changed. Other things are abandoned in place at Cape Canaveral, some of the launch complexes. Where Apollo 1, that tragic fire took place, is simply 3 concrete pillars, and abandoned in place is stenciled on those pillars. So there are things that are preserved and are used ongoing, and then there are things that are in ruins.
Why is it so important to preserve this heritage and these artifacts?
For me, humanity went to the moon. I mean, it is the ultimate frontier to go into outer space. So I think because it's kind of recent, we're running up now on the 48th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, we need to look back and say, how do we evaluate that era, post-World War II, the Cold War? What happened in the world, and how did we get into space? So I think now is the time to look back, even though archaeologists tend to look at things much older than this, but it's time to look back and say, how can we evaluate the significant properties and protect them?
The book talks about the space race between the United States and the then Soviet Union. This was also going on during the Cold War between the 2 countries. How much did the Cold War influence the space race?
Well, the Cold War was played out on Earth between ourselves and the Soviet Union, and it was also played out in space because it was a technological race, and the first group, the first country to get to the moon was going to win the scientific aspects of the Cold War. So we were in a very heated competition with Russia. Frank Borman once told me, he said, the trip that Apollo took, the Apollo astronauts took, was not a voyage of exploration, or it was to try to test new technology. It was a battle in the Cold War, and I was a soldier. So the fact that we went into space really is set in the context of the Cold War, and the Cold War fashions a lot of the decisions made. 8 went very early because they thought the Russians are going to be first on the moon. They were first in everything else. Sputnik, first woman, first astronaut. So really it was part of the Cold War history.
Now, that history, was really felt when the then Soviet Union was able to launch Sputnik into the air. You talked about that in the book some. Could you really describe to us, the impact that had on the United States at that time?
Well, it was a competition in the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58 to launch a satellite into Earth's orbit, and we competed mightily. There were many different teams, but the USSR and us were the big ones. When the Russians got there first and Sputnik went up, people were amazed. It was an amazing technological achievement, but also it signaled now we have a presence outside the Earth, and people were very afraid. People were afraid that space would become a place for weaponry and space would become a place for war. So it was a very trying time, and we didn't get up there really until Explorer 1 and then later Vanguard, which is still up there.
Yeah, the Vanguard is expected to be up there for many years to come. How many?
600 to 2,000 years. So that's a long curation time. So yeah, it's still up there. It even has its own website that tracks it.
Oh, wow. There's so much history, displayed in this book, but also history that connects New Mexico to the space race. Could you share with us about how New Mexico has contributed to the space race?
Well, there are a lot of ways that New Mexico contributed. Let me just mention a couple. One is Colonel John Stapp at Holloman Air Force Base, the fastest man on Earth, who rode a rocket sled over 600 miles an hour to test the G-force on astronauts. And his ability to withstand that and the equipment that was developed in order to allow him to do that, and a 10-mile track at Holloman, is New Mexico's contribution. Colonel Joe Kittinger jumped over the Tularosa Basin in 1960, 19.5 miles above the surface of the Earth to test the parachutes. So these two guys and these two experiments really helped people get into space and helped the astronauts survive in space during the space race.
And there's also a connection between the Apollo Tranquility Site and New Mexico. Could you share with us a little bit about what that is?
Right. Well, the New Mexico Museum of Space History has a plaque, and on it are the coordinates of the Space Museum in New Mexico, and they are linked to the coordinates on the Apollo 11 site on the moon. So it's the first registered space heritage site. Also in 2010, working with my students here in anthropology in a grad seminar, we nominated it to the State Register of Cultural Properties. So the Tranquility Base site is now on the New Mexico Register of Cultural Properties because of our connections and our history in developing all of the spacecraft and the rockets that put those guys there.
The space race, you mentioned that, we're going, this has been decades ago, and there's been generations that have grown up after, man stepped on the moon. Mm-hmm. How do you make that connection to the generations of today, millennials, and then so on, about the importance of preserving these artifacts?
Well, I think you make them aware of the incredible intelligence and dedication and just plain great science and engineering that went into it. And it still needs to be done. The Google X Prize has a competition now to get a robotic on the moon. So hopefully students and younger people can say, hey, this is such an incredibly interesting endeavor and involves so much intelligence and planning and development of ideas that I'd like to be part of that. I mean, I wanted to be an astronaut. I hope that people in the future will too.
Could you just share with us a little bit about what it was like during that time to, have these launches and the excitement behind them, and also, the competition that existed in the world between countries to get into space and to be on the moon? I mean, these were must-see events that were happening and unfolding before our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe that over 600 million people either watched or listened to the early broadcasts of Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. So the whole world was involved. It was set in the Cold War, so of course there was nervousness and fear about, what would happen next. But people were aware that something they look at every night or watch or fall in love with had people on it for the first time. And the landscape was desolate but beautiful. I think that people were enchanted with the fact that this is a presence in the night sky, and now we have the technology to visit there. And it really is the only celestial body humans have been on.
Wow. Well, I really want to thank you so much for joining us on In Focus, and also thank you very much for your work in explaining the history that we have right in front of our eyes today.
Well, thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno.
We got tired of snow in Colorado, and northern New Mexico wasn't quite warm enough, so we decided to come farther south. When I came to Las Cruces, we drove through miles and miles of desert, and then all of a sudden you come to this beautiful farm valley. So I felt very much at home, having grown up on a farm. And it was just beautiful with the mountains in the background. The Oregon mountains are fantastic. The light in New Mexico is clear, and the mountains are sharp and bright, and it makes the colors intense. It's just a magical place. I think that being an artist lets you see the world in a different way. You see things that other people may not notice. You look for shapes and colors and beauty in places that other people may be too busy to notice. Being an artist is great for is sharing that with other people, to say, stop a second, stop in your busy life and look at how beautiful this is. Look at what's out there. This time of year in the valley is so fantastic with the chili harvest going on and the smell of green chili. There's nothing like green chili roasting. It's the best. For painting, I prefer painting red. For eating, I prefer green on most, but on enchiladas, I'll take red. I usually work from dark to light, laying in a lot of the shadows and texture in the shadows, but letting the shadows stay really glowing and transparent in those areas, not covering everything up with paint. And then after I get that laid in, it's hard to see when it's at this stage. There's so much dark, but eventually more and more light will be built on top of it. I use a few brushes in some parts, but almost all of my painting is done with a palette knife. So what that does is let me get a big, thick part of paint and drop it onto the canvas. And it also has some of that watercolor effect of what they call happy accidents, where things will blend in different ways or mix next to each other that are kind of a surprise. It just is something that happens. It's really exciting. And I like to leave some things up to people's imagination. I'll put little marks in there that are hints of chilies, but I don't want to make every individual chili and have somebody have it all done for them. I want the viewer to have a chance to go in and say, oh, discover things. So, oh, I didn't see that before. There's something hidden in there. We go to the grocery store and get our food and don't even think about where it comes from. So this is a way for me to honor that work. I've always loved painting people. I generally don't paint the faces on the chili field workers, and there are a few reasons for that. To most of us, they are faceless. They're out there working and we almost don't see them part of the time. People who have had their families working in the fields really connect. They'll say, wow, that looks just like my grandfather, or that looks like my mom. And if I put a portrait face on, then that connection can be lost. So I think it's kind of neat that they like that. They see that I'm trying to honor the people working there, and it reminds them of something in their heritage. The last few years I've been able to paint full-time plus a little extra, with I think I probably put 50 hours a week into painting and painting related activities, and it's just such a great way to spend the day. I come in here and I'll put on music, or sometimes I'll put on a show. I watch a lot of PBS and turn that on and paint and just lose myself. The time just flies by. My website is jerrysstudio.com. It's JERISSTUDIO.com. I'm working on each painting. At that time, it's my favorite, but I love sharing them with people. I love seeing it go to somebody who really loves the color and the subject and can enjoy it, because I want to go on and do the next one.
That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition, 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.